For those of you who won't be able to join us in person, we thought we would give you the highlights, some of the highlights of the policy seminar ahead of time, which is why we've invited Daniel Heller today to give a webinar on the question of how digital currencies should be regulated. And we're very pleased to be able to welcome Daniel today to the SEACEN Center. And just to give you a quick introduction, Daniel has recently joined the Center for Blockchain Technology at University College London after serving as a visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Before that, Daniel had an illustrious career in central banking and international organizations, including heading the financial stability at the Swiss National Bank, being the head of the Secretariat of the Committee on Payments and Settlement Systems at the BIS, and being the Executive Director for Switzerland, Poland, Serbia, Azerbaijan, and 4 Central Asian republics. He comes to us today, as I said, as the new faculty member of the Center for Blockchain Technology, and to talk about how digital currency should be regulated. So with that, Daniel, over to you. Thanks again for coming, and we're all looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Ole, for the kind introduction. It's great to be here, and it's great to be back in Kuala Lumpur. Today, I'm going to talk about how digital currencies should be regulated. I may add a little disclaimer that these are just, say, my personal views that I have not only to a limited extent discussed with the people who are actually in charge. So that's what I take, given from my background of what I think would be good approaches to regulate digital currencies. So what is the issue? Excuse me. So I'm trying to advance the slide here. So in order not to lose time, I just give a preview of the next slide I'm going to show you. So what is the issue? We have to start with a couple of definitions of what we think what digital currencies are. I don't think there's one definition, but one useful distinction is that we say that digital currencies are currencies that are stored on a blockchain, meaning sequentially, or on a distributed ledger. And then the next important distinction is whether it's there is an issuer of the currency or someone who is behind the currency, or whether there's no one behind the currency. So the one of these borderless schemes with what I would call democratic governance, where the protocol states how changes can be made, would be Bitcoin or Ether. And then the other type of digital currencies is more the conventional one, where we have the issuer is incorporated in a certain jurisdiction, and it has traditional governance in the sense of there is a board of directors that makes changes to the protocol, and so on. These are mostly initial coin offerings, most of the initial coin offerings, but it's also schemes like Ripple or USC, the utility settlement coin that is developed by the banking sector these days. So I think the CPMI, the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructures, put the issue quite nicely in 2015 when it said that the borderless online nature of digital currencies and the absence of an identifiable identifiable issuer of the instrument pose particular challenges to attempts at regulation at the national authority might make. Although other identifiable third-party providers might be more easily regulated. So for these borderless schemes, that's exactly the issue. There's no identifiable issuer of the instrument, and because there is no identifiable issuer, we cannot impose regulation on this issuer. But there's a way out, that we can impose regulation on third parties that work with the digital currency. And that's exactly the approach that is being taken now. There are 4 areas of regulation that I find are important. The first one, and the one that has gotten the most attention, is anti-money laundering and combat of financing of terrorism, AMLCFT. We have their guidance from the international body that is responsible, the Financial Action Task Force, and I will discuss this guidance in a minute. This guidance is mostly built on what the United States has done in 2013 in terms of AMLCFT regulation. The other area that is relevant is taxation. Digital currencies are assets and financial assets, and countries tax financial assets. So obviously, digital currencies should also be taxed. At the international level, we have the OECD and the Global Forum that develops standards for how corporates are taxed and how the exchange of information between countries should take place. So ultimately, the Global Forum would have to be in charge for issues of taxation and in the exchange of information. The third area that is relevant is securities regulation. We have to decide whether digital currencies are securities, or what type of markets regulation is applicable. This is mostly relevant, and I will talk about this for initial coin offerings. And the international body that is responsible for regulation of securities is IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commissions. And the other dimension is, are digital currencies payment instruments? So the area that would be relevant there is payment systems oversight, and the international body would be the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructures. So in the next few minutes, what I will do is I will go through these 4 areas and highlight the relevant issues.
Dan, will you take question in between as well?
That's up to you.
Okay.
When
okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so AML-CFT. What you see here on the left-hand side is a screenshot of Ether transactions. Ether is one of the borderless digital currency schemes. These are transactions that have been posted on the ledger. And what you see there is one column is from, and the other column is to. So in the column from and to, this is typically an alphanumeric identifier. So there's no street address, no name, nothing. So each participant has a unique identifier that you see there in these columns. And clearly, in terms of regulation or supervision, this is difficult, right? Because you don't really know who is behind this alphanumeric code. The beauty of digital currencies is, however, if you have one identifier and all transactions are stored on a blockchain, you basically can trace back all the transactions that a single identifier has done. These are public ledgers. So say if you know who is behind this first identifier, the 1, the 0x1, etc., then you know you can trace back the entire history of payments, right? And that's is used a lot in AML and CFT. The authorities try to find out who is behind an identifier, and then they can trace all the transactions. But clearly, there's a lot of work, investigative work involved in this. So, as I mentioned before, the approach is here that we go not directly after the borderless digital currency, but that the regulation is on the entities that are in between the borderless digital currency scheme and the regulated fiat currency system. These for AMLCFT, the Financial Action Task Force has issued guidance in 2015, and they pretty much build on what the FATF has done for prepaid payment cards, for mobile payments, and for internet payment services. So who is subject to the guidance of the FATF? It's exchanges that exchange digital currency into fiat currency, say Bitcoin into US dollars and so on, Ether into US dollars, euros, etc. There are two types of exchanges that can be centralized or decentralized, so both of them fall under this guidance. Then the second group that has to be compliant with the guidance are wallet providers. These are institutions that provide safekeeping of the assets. You saw before these alphanumeric identifiers. These are wallet providers provide like a custody account for these identifiers. They know who you are, etc. It's kind of like what a bank does. Like a bank keeps track of your bank account, the wallet provider keeps track of your alphanumeric identifier in Ether, Bitcoin, etc. And finally, it's payment processors and senders. These are, think of remittance companies that take US dollars and make a Bitcoin transfer to somewhere else, to Guatemala, for instance, and there they exchange it back into quetzales, the local currency. So all these three groups have to meet the guidance of the FATF. In a nutshell, the requirements that these institutions have to meet is that they have to register with the national authority, and they have to use a risk-based know your customer and AML-CFT process. What this means in essence is that they have to identify the users. So you have to submit your address, passport copy, and so on. They have to verify it. And then in terms of the AML-CFT process, they have to have an algorithm where they track the transactions. And finally, they have obviously to report suspicious transactions to the registration authority. This is, I would say, a standard process in the AML-CFT world. credit card companies have to do it, banks have to do it, and also these product providers for digital currencies.
Sorry, Daniel, before you go on, can I ask a question on this? I mean, I can understand that an exchange needs to be registered in a particular country, say Malaysia. It's not clear to me. I mean, the wallet could be anywhere, as far as I know. I mean, the wallet could be hosted by a website in New Zealand, or it could be in Mongolia, or it could be in Guatemala. To what extent do the wallet? I mean, you say that they are required to do all these things, but I mean, we've seen in terms of some of sort of other jurisdictions, in terms of sort of tax treatment, that there are, I mean, countries that do not follow the FATF regulations. To what extent is there sort of a scope that there might be countries that offer some of these services that do not fall under these regulations?
Yes, I think I'm about to talk about this.
Oh, sorry.
But I mean, we have to see, like, it is possible to use Ether or Bitcoin and not use a wallet. If you are technologically a little bit savvy, you can do this on your own. So if you want to go around the regulation, you can do it. However, if you want to exchange it, your Bitcoin holdings or Ether holdings into fiat currency, you have to, someone will have to check you. I think that's the, and then of course there's the issue of how is the regulation applied? You know, is it, if there are countries where they don't apply the regulation, then of course you can go around it.
So I mean, if I may, Daniel, so one nexus is when the currencies are being converted back to fiat currency. But then there's also the issue of if you just function in that virtual space and you're just going from one digital currency to the other currency without using an exchange or without using a wallet, that would pose challenges from an AML perspective as well.
But this would be allowed in the sense that there's no regulation. But you can go to a digital currency exchange that exchanges Bitcoin into Ether or Monero or Zcash and so on. And there's literally no regulation. So but the idea is really, as long as there's the fiat world, sooner or later, you will want to go back. Right? But conceivably, at one point, there could be regulation that goes after the digital currency, the pure digital currency exchanges too. The issue there is, what do you do if this is just a network of core developers somewhere? And then it's really not, that doesn't have a bank account, that is in no way linked to the regulated financial system. That's problematic.
Thank you.
And I think, Ole, if you brought up a very relevant point, is that these FATF standards have not been implemented consistently. This has been my sense when I started to work on this last year, that you could see exchanges on the internet where you would not know where they are located. It would not say. From the languages, they could have been in Russia, they could have been in China, anywhere. And I think now the G20 took this up in the statement of March of this year. The finance ministers and central bank governments, they said that we commit to implement the FATF standards as they apply to crypto assets. So that's kind of a new word. They call it crypto assets. Look forward to the FATF review of those standards. So the FATF is reviewing the guidance that I was just presenting. And finally, they call on the FATF to advance global implementation. So that's exactly the point, right? There was uneven implementation of these guidance, and now the G20 says you have to do that. So let's see what will happen there. The banks, of course, also play a very important role in that system. So what we see here, that banks around the world are very risk averse when it comes to companies with who offer services in digital currencies, and that's, I think, very similar to what we see in the correspondent banking world, where just some banks in certain areas or banks in certain areas do have problems finding correspondent banks in US dollars, euros, and so on, because the correspondent banks are very risk averse. Like they're afraid that they may violate AMLCFT provisions and get punished. I've heard of asset managers, for instance, that when they started to offer a digital currency to some of their clients, that their bank said, okay, now we have to close down your account. So the risk aversion is really pretty severe. What we see now, especially in the context of initial coin offerings, that some banks offer bank accounts to ICO issuers, but they ask for full KYC and AML process. So they will require the issuer to do the full Monty KYC of everyone who buys a token. And also they require the issuer to run an AMLCFT algorithm, so to track all the Ether transactions that an investor has done in the past. Technology is quite helpful here because this can be done online reasonably easily. So now let's move to taxation, the next big area. I think most countries have now clarified how digital currency should be taxed, and that's usually embedded in the normal tax framework. There are some cases that are more complicated than others. For instance, in countries with capital gains tax, it gets kind of messy in the sense that if you spend digital currency to buy a coffee, you may have capital gains that is taxable on that transaction, and you have to keep track of this capital gain and report it at the end of the year. So this obviously does not make it very appealing to use a digital currency for payment purposes. A country where this is the case is the United States, and some people say that's why there's not a lot of traction of Bitcoin payments in the US. In addition, what we also see is that now in the US, there is an agreement with the tax authorities, the IRS, with the largest digital currency exchange, that for the most active and the biggest American participants in the exchange, their tax data is submitted directly to the tax authorities. So if you are a big American Bitcoin trader and you hold more than a certain amount of Bitcoin in your wallet, this goes directly to the IRS. As far as I know, the US is the only country where this is the case. In the other countries, you just when you fill your tax return, you submit, you just declare your holdings. At the international level, very recently we have seen an agreement at the OECD and the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes, where 102 countries have agreed to exchange tax information across borders. And for 2017, 2018, these first exchanges are taking place between some 50 countries. So far, this is only information on bank accounts of individuals. So digital currency holdings are not included yet. But I do think at one point down the road, probably digital currency holdings will also be included in the cross-border information exchange. Now let me talk a little bit about initial coin offerings. One reads a lot about it. Let me start with a definition. Initial coin offerings take place when a startup issues its own digital currency in exchange for typically Ether, sometimes Bitcoin and fiat currency. So the startup issues its own token. The proceeds that the startup receives are used for the development of a digital platform, a software, or some other type of project. And the startup issues these coins, and the coins can be used to use the platform at the future stage when the project is finished. So 3 things. First, the conversion of Ether into another digital currency. Then the proceeds are used to develop a digital platform. And finally, the tokens of the issuer can, after a few months or a year, be used to buy the products that have been the products or services that have been developed. There are typically one can divide the categories of initial coin offerings into 3 types of tokens. A payment token that is just used to make payments, like in Bitcoin or Ether. It's not a claim on the issuer. Probably the biggest category are so-called utility tokens. They provide access, digital access to the platform that is going to be developed. And the third one is asset tokens. Clearly, it's, for instance, if the underlying instrument is a debt instrument like a bond or equity on the blockchain, this is an asset token. It's also an asset token if you have a physical asset like real estate that you tokenize and put on the blockchain. So what are the risks, the benefits and risks of ICOs? I think one of the big advantages of ICOs is really that it globalizes financial markets. You can invest potentially invest from everywhere in the world in startup projects, and in turn, if you are a startup anywhere in the world, you can tap financial resources from everywhere in the world. This, of course, bypasses traditional financial intermediation by banks and venture capital firms. So this is pretty much decentralized intermediation. Clearly, there are also risks. One of the biggest risks is that your startup may be a fraud, that the only goal is to issue the token, to get the ethers, and but not have a serious project behind it. And there's also business risk. I mean, these are startups that are most likely to fail. We know from the conventional startup space that 9 out of 10 startups will not make it. With an ICO, you still have this risk. So obviously, there are some advantages, but this is a high-risk investment. What are the regulatory approaches? We see a very, very wide spectrum of approaches. A key element is here securities regulation. If your token is viewed to be a security, then regulation is much tighter, right? Then you fall under the standard of securities regulation, which implies issuing a prospectus. It implies it has consequences where your token can be traded. You have to go to a regulated exchange, etc. So if your national authorities think that your token is a security, then it becomes very costly. Now in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission is responsible, and in various statements they have said that they think all ICOs are securities. Why do they come to this conclusion? One of the tests that the SEC has been applying since, I think, the 1940s is whether a financial product is an investment contract. And if you're an investment contract, then you're also a security. And you're an investment contract when the profits, and now I quote, come solely from the efforts of others. Right? So if you provide financial resources and the profits come from the efforts of others, which is usually the case if you give money to a company, then you're a security. So in the US, it is a reasonable assumption that if you do an ICO, you will be a security. Then China, in September last year, banned ICOs after many ICOs have been taking place there. Here, closer in the region in Singapore, the MAS has, I think also in last summer, issued that AMLCFT considerations are very important for ICOs. And I think a couple of weeks ago it stated that the MAS is assessing if additional regulation are required for investor protection. The Financial Markets Authority of Switzerland, FINMA, has issued what I think probably the most comprehensive guidelines on ICOs, where it uses these 3 categories of tokens that I mentioned before. And it says that it considers utility tokens to be securities if they function solely or partially as an investment in economic terms. So this, of course, leaves some room for interpretation what is meant by this, but FINMA is of the view that if there is an investment component in an ICO, then it's a security. In my view, I think good ICO regulation would take into account that it's a crowdfunding tool, that ICOs are used to fund projects. And we have regulation on crowdfunding in the United States, for instance, that could be applied. This would mean that an ICO issuer would have to disclose who is behind it, where it's incorporated. There could be a cap on how much money can be raised, and there should also be a requirement to do audits of the financial statements and other things. So if I look at what is out there also in Switzerland, this in a way still comes short of what I think is necessary, because it does not take into account the crowdfunding dimension of ICOs. Let me now turn to the last slide, are digital currencies payment instruments. Here we have The standard tool are the CPSS IOSCO Principles for Financial Market Infrastructures. I wrote down a few of the principles here. One, no, not all of them. One is on legal basis. It says that the FMI should have a well-founded, clear, transparent, and enforceable legal basis. In terms of governance, it says that an FMI should have governance arrangement that are clear and transparent, promote the safety and efficiency of the FMI, and support the stability of the broader financial system. And in terms of the settlement asset, money settlement, for instance, it states that an FMI should conduct its money settlement in central bank money, where practical and available, so not everywhere, not always. But if central bank money is not used, then the FMI should minimize credit and liquidity risk. So we could, just as a mental exercise, we could take these principles and apply them to the digital currencies that are out there. This has not been done because the digital currencies out there have not been viewed as systemically important, but just for the sake of the argument, if we did that, then what we see is that the borderless schemes like Bitcoin and Ether have, in my view, have a very high likelihood that they will not be compliant with the principles for FMIs. For instance, because this decentralized governance arrangements that they have are not compliant with what is required, right? That you have someone who is in charge to support the stability of the broader financial system. This does not seem to be possible. Then also the legal basis. There's no clearly enforceable legal basis because these schemes are borderless, and also they cannot, in terms of controls of liquidity risk, Bitcoin has a fixed supply. No one can supply Bitcoin if there's more liquidity needed. So this cannot be compatible with the principle for money settlement. What I think, however, would be possible if there is a digital currency that is issued by a consortium, by a tech firm, or by a consortium of banks, that would be issued in very close cooperation with a central bank that would meet all of these principles, like that the digital currency scheme would have a clear legal basis, that there is a government structure that makes changes, and also where liquidity and credit risk can be managed in the system.
Excellent. Daniel, thank you very much for giving a concise and yet extensive overview of some of the big issues in regulation. I certainly learned a lot, and I think this is the case for at least the people in the room here. We do have a question, and the question is as follows. So the first question. So please feel free to email in terms of the chat function to send us questions. Let me start with the first one, which is as follows. How about regulating cryptocurrencies on the basis of private issuers of currency or capital flows? This is something that's pursued in countries with capital controls such as China. The IMF has adopted a stance accepting capital flow management measures in certain scenarios. The avenue of countries using cryptocurrencies to avoid UN sanctions would also be relevant. Could restrictions, regulations on cryptocurrencies via this rationale be something to be explored?
Okay, so I mean, I think a lot of it is about the implementation of existing regulation. So if you are an exchange, a digital currency exchange, you cannot do business with sanctioned countries. So you cannot have clients who are in sanctioned countries. So this is not an avenue to go around sanctions. If the FATF guidance is applied appropriately, then are digital currencies a means to go around capital flow measures? Again, I would say if the exchange is compliant with the rules, the guidance, it cannot do business with people that are in countries under capital control measures. Concretely, like a US exchange could not provide accounts to Chinese counterparts. Now, are they doing this? I don't know. But in my reading, this would clearly be not in the spirit of the guidelines. Then the other is another question, or there's a...
I think there's a second part. There's a second part to it. Could restrictions / regulation on cryptocurrency via this rationale be something to explore? But I think you have answered it, actually.
Okay.
But I have a question of my own. We had a scenario in Malaysia where an exchange, Luna, I think it was actually, the accounts were actually frozen by the tax authorities here. And my understanding from anecdotal evidence was that the way consumers got around that restriction is that they would ask someone in, say, New Zealand to convert to New Zealand currency. The only issue is if you don't have a fiat account in New Zealand, how do you do it? But this was how they were circumventing the requirements here. So is it possible that even with all these regulations, there are still ways around these regulations? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I don't know this case, but in general, I mean, all these regulations, there's always a way around it. But I think the basic approach should be to make it difficult to go around it. Like, you know, capital controls, you can even use credit cards to go around certain capital flow, capital controls. It's not related to digital currencies. And of course, you can even go, you can go to the over-the-counter market. If you find someone who provides you with the fiat currency and you are able to open an account somewhere over the counter, you can do a lot that is not captured in these regulations.
I know that Daniel's presentation was very clear, but I didn't know that it was that clear. Surely there must be other questions out there for Daniel on the issue of regulation of digital currencies.
Could be. Let's try and open the mic and see if, let's open the mic, ask them to open their mics and see if they're going to direct it, because it could be take a while for them to type. So if you talk, can you open your mics if you have questions and use your mic? We'll try and take the questions that way if it's much easier. we'll let Hans ask next questions.
Okay. So, okay, we'll give you a minute to think.
But let me say something.
Okay. Sure.
I mean, what you read these quotes where people say, you know, digital currencies like Bitcoin, they're just only criminals use them. So if you go back to, I think it's my slide number 4, this one, right? So you could think that you can hide behind your identifier and no one will ever find out who you are. And that's the appeal for criminals. This is pretty risky, I think, in the sense that the criminal authorities, they may find out who you are because you have a wallet somewhere. And if they don't, they may find out one of your partners in a transaction because they find they can identify who is behind these numbers. Everything is public. We have big data analysis that can be very powerful. So I really think the fact that this is public makes it very risky to use if you're a criminal. I think it's really people who say, you know, Bitcoin, and they know it. I really think there's much less criminal activity on Bitcoin than a lot of people think, because it's so transparent.
Well, on that, let me ask you a, let's call it provocative, maybe even unfair question. So I do apologize in advance for asking this question. And this is, I mean, when you think about a digital currency, and you know, there's this big discussion about to what extent it performs roles of the 3 roles of money and so on and so forth. Now, if I think about cash, one of the advantages of cash, it's totally anonymous, and we are kind of okay with that, or central banks or regulators are okay with the fact that cash is also anonymous. Cash can be used for all of these illegal purposes, but the advantages of cash seem to outweigh the negative aspects of the anonymity of cash. Now, why shouldn't that not be true in terms of digital currencies, where the advantages of digital currencies outweigh the potential negative impacts? So why is everyone so worried about the illegal transactions in terms of the digital currencies when we kind of condone them when it comes to cash?
I think I mean, that's what you read too, right? Some crypto enthusiasts say, you know, the the payment instrument of the underworld is still cash. And I mean, that's probably true. And by the way, there are a lot of analogies between digital currencies and cash, in the sense that it really allows for peer-to-peer transactions across borders. It's fast, so but it's pretty similar.
Mm. We had another question, so thank you for the question. And this is asking Daniel in terms of sort of just verifying whether your general recommendation is for the relevant regulatory authorities to regulate private digital currencies. Would that be the bottom line of your presentation?
You know, I attend conferences of the kind of in the regulated world, and also conferences in the crypto space. And I usually say, you know, this has to be regulated like any other asset and so on. And in the crypto space, they always give me a very hard time. They say, you know, you're just old school, and there are always ways around, and we can that kind of regulators will never get after us. And I think that's very naive. I think we have to admit that regulators are very powerful, that these are digital transactions that can be tracked. There's encryption that can be decrypted by powerful government agencies. So maybe 1 in 100 may get away, but the idea that you can hide activities on the blockchain is just not realistic. And I do think it's about even-handedness. It's really, I think, in the financial sector, there should be innovation, there should be new entrants, but the playing field has to be leveled. And so I do think if you want to be in blockchain, in digital assets, you can be there, but you have to follow the same rules as everyone else. So I'm in that sense, I'm old school, and I think the approach is good. That we have for now, we should go after the intersection between the financial system and the blockchain world. That's exactly right.
Okay, we have a question in the room.
Yes, this is Hans Genberg. You mentioned, Daniel, that at least I understood that the regulation is more complicated in the context of cryptocurrencies because there are new technologies involved and so on. What does that imply for regulatory authorities? Do they have in your opinion, the required personnel, the required expertise currently, or do they really need to do something different now in order to regulate these new assets?
I think it's definitely challenging for the regulators to keep up with these new developments, but at the same time, it's also not new. There's always been innovation in the financial sector, and regulators always had to catch up. Think of like new financial instruments pre-financial crisis. There was a lot of innovation, and no one understood so well what was going on. It's the same here. But regulators have to, they need to have people who understand that, and people who have time to study the implications. And I think the people who launch these products, it's not their job to think about financial stability implications of these products, right? But the regulators have to think about it. Central banks too. And there's a lot of interest, I think, in the regulatory community in these new technologies.
Okay, I will allow my boss one more question, and then we return.
He was not satisfied.
There's a technological risk involved in all this, I presume. And who should regulate that aspect of it, the crypto risk? And that definitely, it seems to me, requires different types of people than those who are traditionally regulating financial markets. It requires tech-savvy people.
Yes, I'll give you an example. I talked to a friend of mine who is tokenizing collateral or collateral management in banks. And of course, the advantages are incredible. If you have collateral on the blockchain, you can move the collateral much easier than you can do it today in today's infrastructure. But he tells me if they want to assess operational risk in this new world, he says, no one has ever done that. This is totally new. So even for the people who do it, who are developing these tools, it's new for them. And of course, for the regulators, it's also new. So I think you are spot on. You know, this means regulators have to acquire new expertise in terms of risk management and what it means for the system. It's very challenging. Right? And then we have all the old issues of people in the private sector earn more money than if you work for a stale banking supervisor and so on. So it's deja vu.
Okay, we've got two more questions from the audience, from the floor, however you want to call it. And the question is, what is the risk impact when authorities within a country have different stances? So, for example, the payment system. Sorry, just finding the question again. So the payment system stance might be very different from the securities and commodities stance. What sort of problems does that throw up?
Yes, I think in my perception, you know, all the agencies have a very focused view on their turf, and this is really an area where you have to sit together and exchange views, and ultimately you should have a consistent framework on how you regulate digital currencies. It's very it's really a must.
Yeah.
Because if you don't know what the rules are, if you don't know who thinks what, it's very hard for the people who develop the products.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what regulators owe to them.
Yeah. That sort of leads us nicely to the next question, which is about the coordinated regulation of cryptocurrencies. So the question is, or the person asking the question points out that we've seen providers migrate to countries with lighter regulation, i.e. exchanges moving to Malta, for example. The advanced economies are generally ahead in terms of regulation, so will risks flow to the less developed markets which lag behind in regulation?
Yeah, of course there is regulatory arbitrage, and we see some of this now in the ICO space, right? That they say, you know, I mean, first of all, I think a lot of issuers realized that the United States is too risky. So they moved away, they moved to Switzerland, because they thought in Switzerland we get a green light, we have regulators who understand it, also to Singapore to some extent. And now maybe they move on to Malta because they think the Swiss are too tough on them. So is this good? I think it's hard to say. Regulation has to be smart. I think then it's really helpful. If it's not smart, then the market moves somewhere where it's not regulated, and that's also not good.
Okay. Right. Okay, there's a comment from the floor, which is that the policy decision to regulate private digital currencies should be adequately supported by massive investment in skills, tools, and risk management capability. I think this goes back to the question Hans had, that as we know, and you made the point that regulators are always lagging behind financial innovation, and I couldn't agree more. Let me be selfish and just ask one more question before we let Daniel go. And this is not so much whether, I mean, we talked about regulation, yes or no. I think sort of I'm asking a different angle, which is, you know, I mean, we've seen a lot of speculation in this sort of digital currency sphere. Is there a danger that sort of regulation breeds even more of that if regulators are seen to be entering this field, that there may now be scope for kind of liability insurance, or sort of that regulators are condoning some of the very activities that we're trying to sort of counteract. If that makes any sense.
Are you now talking about more the borderless schemes?
No, I mean, I'm talking about, I'm bringing this up in the sense that I mean, we've seen Bitcoin going from whatever it was to sort of $20,000 and back to $10,000. And I mean, that's been described as a sort of a Wild West type of investment and speculation. I'm worried that if we now issue regulation in this area, that we're kind of giving the green light to more of that investors will feel more secure in investing, sort of a moral hazard argument, that if there's a perception that regulation is in place, that it's no longer buyer beware, but there may now be sort of lawsuits and claims for liability. You know, the government should step in and reimburse investors for their bad investment decisions and so on.
Okay, I understand. I mean, the question is, would it make sense for authorities just to say, you know, we stay out, this is risky, and you are on your own? And I think I have some sympathy for this approach. But I also think there's one big drawback, and it's more on the political level. You know, if something goes wrong, if you have a massive, let's say there's an ICO collects, well, it's not unrealistic, 250 million in 10 minutes, and it turns out to be a fraud. Some important people lose money. There will be, on the political level, someone will say, why did you not protect us? Why did you allow this? And this has happened in history time and again. So I really come down on the side where I say regulators have to step in a smart way, because they will be liable no matter what. If they don't step in, people will say, why did you not step in? And if they step in, at least, hopefully, they can get rid of some of the scams and make the environment more secure.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel, for that. I think this is an appropriate place to close proceedings. Let me thank Daniel very much for giving up his time. He arrived last night. I think he was in his hotel at 1 a.m. this morning or something. So thank you very much for being a real trooper and coming in today and doing the webinar. This is leading up to the Policy Summit tomorrow and on Friday. I think we will try and make as much of the material available to the public, publicly available on our website after the seminar as we can. I'm looking forward to seeing many representatives from the central banks on over the next 2 days. So thank you very much for joining us, for emailing in your questions, for your interest, and we hope to see you on one of our webinars soon. So have a good day, and talk to you next time.
Thank you.